Okay, let's go ahead and talk about Crooks. So chapter 4 was a chapter mostly surrounding this particular character, and we knew who he was already, but we got a lot more insight as to who he really is and maybe why he is the way that he is. So we're going to talk about him a little bit. There are some questions that I'm going to have you answer as we go along, some things to think about. You'll also want to have your book out because I will ask you to actually go back and look at some pages as we go through this kind of discussion of chapter 4. Okay, so I'm going to start with a quote from a guy named Dr. Richard E. Hart. He is from Bloomfield College in New Jersey, and he says, Crooks has his own room, furniture, and books. Hence, he is better off than the other ranch hands. He is not a victim of racism. So before we start, I'd like you to personally respond to that. What do you think about that? What are your thoughts when you hear that? And do you agree? Do you disagree? If so, why? Okay, so go ahead and answer that question to start. So I personally, I don't agree with Dr. Richard Hart. I think, and probably you guys are going to put similar answers to this, but the fact that he has his own room, furniture, and books is really not necessarily by his choice. And I think the fact that he is forced into a segregated situation makes him exactly a victim of racism. We know that segregation is a racist institution. And so the fact that he is pushed into it, that he does not necessarily have the choice or the free will to choose whether or not he wants to stay in the bunkhouse with the other guys, that I think makes it deeply problematic. So I'm sorry, Dr. Richard E. Hart, but no on that. If you have another answer, that's awesome. I look forward to reading those. But let's go ahead and move on from there. I just thought it was important to establish that his own personal items, that doesn't necessarily mean it's a luxury. Okay, it's not necessarily a good thing. Speaking of his personal possessions, I would like you right now to open up your books and go to pages 66 through 67. That's right at the beginning. Those pages catalog Crooks's personal possessions. So I'm going to have you guys answer another question. What are some personal possessions that he has that reveal something about him? I want you to try and list a few of them. Okay, and then think about what might the specific books that he owns reveal, what might those books reveal about him? Okay, because I think they might be kind of significant. So go ahead and answer those questions now. If you look at his possessions, they're all kind of practical and useful items. They are all for work. Okay, none of them are really all for at all for entertainment. They're all related to work. So essentially, his living space is occupied with his with his actual work. So it's not, again, not so much a luxury to have his own space, because his own space, first of all, is on the side of his stable, and second of all, everything that is cluttering his room is related to work. And I know that you guys at home probably appreciate that there's a distance from school when you guys get home. Now, unfortunately, that's not the case right now as we're doing remote learning, but you guys get the idea. Okay, he has shoes, he has rubber boots, he has a big alarm clock. All of those have to do with work or are intended for work. He also has a single-barreled shotgun, and I find that to be really interesting because the fact that he has a gun in his possession, hey, look, this is the 1930s, and you know, it's not illegal or anything like that, but my question would be, okay, so is that a protective measure for him? Has he run into problems in the past where he feels like he needs a shotgun? Or is it just practicality because it's part of his job? Perhaps he has to put down animals at certain times. And so, I don't know, I would just question why the shotgun. And then in terms of the books, he has a tattered dictionary. It is really, really well used. So either that can indicate that it's, you know, a hand-me-down of some sort. Maybe it's secondhand. It could also indicate that he wants to better himself, as, you know, if that's something that he wants to read. Does Crooks read? It kind of seems like he does. The other book I thought was really interesting was the California Civil Code. Now, they are in California, and I wonder, does Crooks have that because he feels like he needs to know his rights? You know what I mean? Perhaps he feels like knowing his rights is a form of protecting him in a situation that could get compromising. Okay, California, although it was not, you know, nothing like the South necessarily in America, racism still existed in California. It still exists today. So I just wonder what would be the purpose of that California Civil Code? Is that kind of like perhaps the shotgun, a protective measure for himself, right? So just something to think about. Next one, Crooks does not initially welcome Lenny, but he eventually says, well, as long as you won't get out and leave me alone, you might as well sit down. So what personality trait do you think that this reveals about Crooks? Well, I don't know, but it kind of seems like he's got this hard outer shell. He is not warm and welcoming, right? It says, well, as long as you won't get out and leave me alone. So clearly that is what he would prefer, okay? You might as well sit down. But notice too that he is not super, super insistent like he is insistent later with Curly's wife, which we'll talk about in a second. Instead, he does allow Lenny to stay, which could indicate that, you know what, maybe he, like most of the other people there, just wants someone to talk to. Maybe he is quite lonely, and so he kind of gives in. Maybe he's got that hard outer shell for, once again, protection. Okay, he feels the need to protect himself with kind of a tough exterior, but maybe he is actually just longing for company. Okay. He says something interesting on page 70. He says, I never knew till long later why he, talking about his father, didn't like that. And he's talking about the fact that his dad didn't like that he played with white children. And then he says, but I know now. So what has Crooks realized about his childhood and his father by reflecting on them as an adult? Well, I think he recognized that white kids grow up to be white adults. And I think that his father already knew that, having encountered probably many white adults, which obviously that's obvious, right? White kids grow up to be white adults. But the problem is when they become white adults, maybe they aren't as friendly, right? Racism is very much a learned thing. And so we learn these habits and these kind of predispositions in our minds and our biases. We learn those. And so I think maybe his father recognized, hey, these white kids might be having fun now. And you guys might be, enjoying each other's company now, but it won't always be that way. And so I think his father was trying to instill within Crooks a distrust of white people, right? And why? Once again, it goes back to protection. Right? Like, why that hard exterior? Why the shotgun? Why the civil code? I think it's all about protecting himself. And I think that for him, it's, a way of, that's his way of life. That is who he is he is distrustful as a means of protection, and maybe a necessary means of protection. Later in the evening, Crooks taunts Lenny. It's really kind of sad. He pretends that he thinks George may have abandoned him. I'm curious what you think. Why do you think he immediately, what do you think is his immediate reason for playing this trick? Okay. And then I think he also might have a deeper reason. This one might be a little bit more obvious, but remember on page 72, he says, suppose you didn't have nobody. Suppose you couldn't go into the bunkhouse and play rummy because you was black. How'd you like that? Okay, so I think that one on page 72 really indicates that, hey, he wants someone to empathize with him. He wants someone to relate with him. He wants that relationship. He desires that kind of, I don't know, just somebody to be around and kind of understand and sympathize with him. However, I want to go back to this, what is his immediate reason for playing this trick? I'm not going to make you necessarily answer that as a response, but think about this. You got Crooks, who is used to being in a position without authority, okay, and without power. And now he's hanging around with Lenny, and I think he may sense his own advantage. I think Crooks may sense, wait a minute, I can screw with this guy. I can be the one with the power. And so I think initially that might be Crooks's kind of reason for playing the trick on Lenny, is that he doesn't normally enjoy power. Lenny, because he's unfortunately an easy target, gives Crooks that opportunity to exercise power over him. And then, like I said on page 72, or like it says on page 72, he really just wants someone to empathize with him as well. I think it may have turned into that. This next part, okay, so body language. We are going to reread pages 80 through 83, and then as we do that, and I'm gonna switch my screen for just a second, but as we do that, what do you notice? I want you to be thinking, what do you notice about the physical description given to Crooks during these threats? What happens to his voice? What are his reactions? Okay, so notice physically what happens to Crooks in this section. And this is one of the most uncomfortable, awful sections. Are you guys ready? Here we go. Starting here on page 80, it says, Crooks stood up from his bunk and faced her. And he's talking about Curly's wife. I've had enough, he said coldly. You got no rights coming in a colored man's room. You got no rights messing around in here at all. Now you just get out and get out quick. If you don't, I'm going to ask the boss not to ever let you come in the barn no more. Notice here, as it says in my note over here, that Crooks is really bold. Okay, he stands up for himself. He asserts dominance and says, hey, you don't have a right to be in here. And he's absolutely right. She doesn't have any right to be in there. But notice what happens next. I'm not going to read the actual word. It says, she turned on him in scorn. Listen, she said, you know what I can do to you if you open your trap? And then notice what happens to Crooks. Crooks stared hopelessly at her, and then he sat down on his bunk and drew into himself. And I think that's a physical description there, that he drew into himself, that he almost became smaller. Right? He had kind of started to take up less space in the room. She closed in on him. You know what I could do. Crooks seemed once again, look physically, to grow smaller, and he pressed himself against the wall. And that might be both physically pressed himself against the wall, but I think maybe figuratively he feels that way as well, because what does he say? He says, yes, ma'am. Right? She says, well, then you keep your place then. I could get you strung up on a tree so easy it ain't even funny. Ugh, part makes me sick. Crooks then had reduced himself to nothing. Once again, I think that is figurative, but I think in some ways there's a physical reduction of space, right? He is drawing within himself. He's making himself smaller physically. At this point, there was no personality, no ego, nothing to arouse either like or dislike. He said, yes, ma'am, and his voice was toneless. I think I'm just going to go ahead and stop there. We won't go all the way to 83, but I think this part is really significant, noticing his body language and what she was able to do very, very quickly to him physically. Obviously, there's a matter of his dignity, which she has completely stripped him of. But I think it's important to understand, like, space, the space that we take up in this world is important too. And as we see, like, a physical shrinking of Crooks, that's not just physical, that's reflecting what's happening to himself, right? His sense of worth. And so this part is extremely sad and upsetting. And so you guys read it, so you know the rest of it. Okay, I think this might be the last one. Crooks offers initially to join the Dream farm group, right? We got Lenny, we got George, we got Candy, and now Crooks had actually said, well, you know, I could help out. But then at the end, he retracts his offer. I'll read it to you real quickly. But he says, well, just forget it. I didn't mean it. I was just fooling. I wouldn't want to go to no place like that. Why do you think he says he did not really mean it? I think once again, this what Curly's wife did to him and diminished him so physically and so emotionally. I think that it reminded him of, sadly, what his place was within this group of white people in particular. I think that he remembered what his dad had taught him, that he can't trust white people, right? I think he remembered who he is in terms of, I've got to protect myself. And so trusting this group of people, as nice as they are, Candy, Lenny, and George, it just wasn't going to work. I think he's lost all hope for his dream. And I don't think his dream was the farm. I think his dream was acceptance and belonging. And I think he lost that dream. He lost all hope in that dream because, again, he remembered his place. And it's very, very sad. This is a very sad chapter in the book. So that's all I have for you today with chapter 4. Let me know if you have any questions, and we'll keep going with Of Mice and Men. So please do plan to read chapter 5 by Friday, so by tomorrow, and we'll talk about that more tomorrow. Thanks.